Coming up on Mount Hermeneutics, the end times, the second coming, the rapture. We all have kind of a movie that plays in our mind whenever we hear those terms. But what does the Bible actually say about this? We're going to get into it, so keep it right here. You're listening to Mount Hermeneutics, where three Marines give their perspective on God, faith, and spirituality with a heavy lean on the divine council worldview. This is not your grandma's Sunday school, nor is it always for the Christian faint of heart. Nothing about who we are or what we say make us experts. But you better believe we'll have a take, and perhaps it won't suck.
You're comparing what we do to professional wrestling.
Yes.
In a matter of speaking, sure.
All right.
In that it's entertainment. This is religious entertainment radio.
Remember that this show is free and available on all podcast platforms, including YouTube, simply by searching Mount Hermeneutics. So please subscribe, ring notification bells, tell everybody you ever met in your entire life that this is the best show you've ever actually seen or heard. Whether you're lying or not, it doesn't matter, because it is. And if you're new to where we are, I am Andre, and these two guys here are my dear friends, Matt and Brian. Fellas, what is up?
Gentlemen,
Hey.
hello.
Good day.
Yeah. So what's going on? It's new.
Yeah, it's kind of odd to have a Monday night, right? Like,
Yeah, but it won't be for long because this is
right. It'll be a regular. It'll be on the regular.
Yeah, and it struck me today that it's right as we're recording. It's October 7th, the anniversary of that atrocity that happened a year ago, and we're talking about eschatology, and it's not unrelated. Actually,
one of our biggest shows of the year and some change that we've been doing this thing that the Israel Gaza.
Was that a year ago?
Yes.
Was it?
Yeah.
Like today.
Well,
I mean, not our show, but
right.
We talk like 7th. Next week.
Yeah. That's crazy. Time flies when there's still a war in the Ukraine. It's that I thought would be like 30 days and be over with. And yeah, now we've got like multiple wars going on in different places, and we're just chilling at home.
I have so many opinions about that I know I brought it up, but I just, yeah, I'm gonna resist it. It'll be a different show if I get into that. So
it's funny because Delani's watching Dexter, and in one of the later seasons, which was a long time ago, it's Ukrainian like mobsters doing stuff in Miami, and we're like, we didn't really talk about Ukraine the same way as we do now. Like, so yeah. It's funny how how corrupt and whatnot that they were at that time, and now we they're not the evil ones. The Russians are.
Now they're not.
That's right. Yeah.
But now that we're giving them billions of dollars.
Yeah, nothing to see.
I mean, we have another hurricane hitting Florida soon. So
right, that's what I was going to say. Is while we're talking about the two different things going on in the rest of the world, then we've got people drowning in the U.S. because of hurricanes and floodwaters and
a federal service that's absolutely inadequate, which is heart-wrenching, especially when it comes to humanitarian stuff. Because as a Marine, being on a MEU, we're actually good at that stuff. And to know that Camp Lejeune is right up the road, and Virginia's got it's where the MEU is at. I think it's disheartening that we don't call our own to come help out.
Speaking of, I'm going to tell a quick story. It's a lighthearted story about a humanitarian event. So a good friend of mine, he's a Marine. He was an Anglico Marine. And for those that don't know what Anglico is, it's the Air Naval Ground Liaison Company. Essentially, they're forward observers that specialize in calling in naval gunfire. And if you don't really think about what naval gunfire is, think about the movie Battleship. What was that? Was it called Battleship?
With Rihanna?
Yeah. Yeah, because when they turned that battleship sideways and the guns were big enough to kill a UFO, right? That's what we're talking about that these guys called in. Anyway.
That was a wildly underrated movie.
I liked it.
It should not have been as good as it was.
I've never seen it.
It's certainly worth a
decent.
watch. Yeah, it's certainly worth a watch.
I mean, it's
And
not. It ain't Citizen Kane, but it's a good movie.
I would rather watch.
Matt's like,
I
I'd
would,
rather watch Battleship, to tell you the
yeah,
truth.
this is I can't watch Citizen Kane. I've tried a couple of times. Anyway,
Mm.
so my buddy's on a Mew, and he'd have to be telling the story. They're in, I think they were headed over to deal with the all of the bloodshed that was going on in Africa in like 92, 93 time frame, like the Rwanda
The
thing.
Rwanda stuff.
Yeah, the Rwanda stuff. Well, anyway, they're in a port, and long story short, a storm comes in, and it's destroying ships in the harbor. Right, so these ships are getting capsized. People are drowning in the water. Well, the commander of the Muse, like, where's my freaking Force Recon guys? Where's my Anglico guys? In his head, he's like, you guys are all, hard charging, you know, Ricky Recon guys. I'm gonna have you guys start jumping in the water and saving people. And they're all like, hell yeah, let's do this. So they all get geared up and they're diving off this ship into the freaking storm to save humans, which is pretty freaking legit, right? So my buddy's telling me the story, and he's like, he runs and he jumps off, and he's like, first of all, it's a long ways down when you jump off the side of a ship into the water. He said the minute his feet left the deck, he was like, wait, I don't swim that well. He spent 45 minutes saving his own life just trying to get back to the ship. Because he was literally dying because he wasn't a strong
I just told
swimmer.
you that story. That's what,
exactly. Well, you just would have refused the order. You'd been like, nah.
I ain't jumping in there. You must be.
I see the way my bank accounts are set up.
But you have to swim qual to get into the Marine Corps, though.
Well, and these guys are all WSQ bubbas. They're all good swimmers, but there's a difference between doing it easily and you did it by the skin of your teeth, and you didn't do it in the swell of a tropical storm that's battering you against the side of a ship and all the other things, right? Like,
and there's no, and you are the rescue swimmer.
right?
It's not the same thing.
Yeah. You are
like
collectively the WSQ guys that were there to make sure you didn't die when you were doing WSQ training.
It seems like we need a little more QC on those operations, like a little.
Well, I think part of what it was is being a SOC unit. I'm not going to say special forces or whatever, right? But being a special operations type unit in peacetime Marine Corps in 92, 93. Those commanders were a little more loosey goosey with their commands. Because
we'll see what happens.
They're like, these guys get to do something real world. Let's get in there and save some humans.
That guy's already typing up the awards and shit. He's already
right.
He's already
well, and it was just so funny because my buddy's telling the story, and he's done his own things and he's been there and done that. And the point of him telling me the story was everybody's not a badass at everything, and there's always somebody more badass. And he's like, here I am, this like super tough guy. And he's like, I almost drowned.
Almost died in some. Oh, damn.
Yeah.
So, Brian, I in the intro, I made a couple of promises there, but you had kind of a concise way of what we're going to be talking about. When we're doing pre-show, can you maybe fill in our people who could be watching and listening right now?
Well, yeah, we conceived of this episode as the third part of a trilogy that started with a listener question about how we're always talking about how this idea of dying and going to heaven as a disembodied spirit that is so basic to Christianity as far as most people are concerned. It's not actually in the Bible. And so we talked about that 2 episodes ago. Last week we talked about consciousness, and now we're talking about eschatology as kind of the natural progression there. Like, I guess to address the question of, well, if we're not hoping, if it's not going to heaven in death, then what is the Christian hope? And that brings us to eschatology. So that's why we are.
So for my friend Gunny Bundy, who's listening right now, what is eschatology? Because I know he's
right.
Like,
what is that word? That's a really weird sounding word.
Are you asking me?
Yeah, you brought it up.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, it's the study of end times.
Study of end times,
like the second coming and what happened, what events precede the second coming, and should we get into the types of eschatology? Just to get that out of the way. Yeah, we'll do that. So there's 3 basic categories, really 4, kind of 5. So there's this passage at the in the end of the book of Revelation, that pictures Jesus returning to earth, ruling for 1,000 years. Then there's the final judgment, and then there's the eternal state, the new heavens and the new earth. There's the premillennial view, which has it, and there's premillennialism, post-millennialism, and amillennialism. The premillennial view is simply that Jesus returns before the 1,000 years. The post-millennial view is that the church, that the 1,000 years actually is this sort of golden age in which the church achieves this this period of triumph throughout the world, where we kind of turn the world into this sort of Christian utopia, and then Jesus returns at the end of that. And then there's amillennialism, which has it that the millennial kingdom started when Jesus ascended into heaven, and it's the church age. Like the church itself is that millennial kingdom that you're reading about in Revelation 20. And then there's the preterist view, and Matt's probably going to have more to add to this or correct me on something, but the preterist view has it that those prophecies have already been fulfilled in our past, like that some see them as future, for like John, who writing Revelation, or Jesus in the Olivet Discourse, but for us they've already been fulfilled. And so there's and there's full preterism, which has it that it's all fulfilled. There is no second coming to look forward to. There's no future state. The book of Revelation all happened in the first century. Then there's partial preterists, who believe that it was partially fulfilled, but there's still some that remains to be fulfilled in the future. And that's the broad strokes. And
Yeah.
Well, and then there's others, right? So there's a handful of kind of like outliers. There's what is it, like futurists, and then idealists or idealism, which are kind of like catch-alls. If the way I kind of read it was, idealists or idealism is basically everything is symbolism, that nothing in Revelation or the Olivet Discourse was intended to be literal in any way, shape, or form. I don't really know what that means, by the way. Like I didn't do any further reading than to understand that there's a group of Christian thinkers that think this.
Those aren't necessarily different options than the 4 that I mentioned, but they're kind of subsets within that. Like some people,
That's fair.
Some people read certain passages as futurist or idealist or whatever, and thereby and by that reasoning, they land in one of those 4 camps.
That's fair. That's actually, that probably makes more sense. And I think the only clarification about, because I did do a fair bit of reading on preterism just because I was curious about it. I didn't know what the word meant. It was when I came across it, I kind of fell into that rabbit hole. Essentially, the full versus partial, the biggest difference is the partials they still believe in Christ's second coming, and that there's, a final resurrection and future events. But they just believe that a lot of the other stuff already happened. And I don't know where the rest of the small points on those lines are. That's probably the only thing I would say. And yeah, that's it.
And my position on all of that, as I was telling you guys before, but the listeners don't know because they don't read our chats.
Probably a good thing.
Yeah. For the purpose of the topic that brought this up, about like what do Christians hope in, with the exception of preterism, which I don't think I think it's preterism isn't really an eschatology. It's more of an NA. It's like a non-eschatology, because it doesn't believe that those are end times that are in view, because it's in the past. But with that excluded,
well, is it end times or end of an age though? So I think preterism does. They don't think it's the end of the world as we know it, but it is the end of that age, and we're into a new age.
I'm excluding it from the point that I'm about to make.
Very well.
But for the purposes of that, I don't think it. I don't think it really matters which, and this, but I want to be clear. I mean this solely in this narrow consideration. I'm not saying it doesn't matter which camp you are. I think there is a correct camp to be in. But for the purposes of answering the question of, well, what are Christians supposed to hope in? I don't think that matters. What the thing that matters, whether you're amillennialist, postmillennialist, or premillennialist, the thing that really matters is that the central hope of Christianity that we find in the New Testament, and we find it among early Christians, is the second coming of Christ. That's the thing that's the motivation behind everything they did. They're looking forward to that time when Jesus returns, and they are raised in glory. And so whether you think we're in the millennium now, or we set the millennium up in preparation for him to come, that's still the hope, wherever you land there. So
Because of this thinking, we have a lot of people that are in the business of predicting when these end times will come, and a lot of people writing tons of books. I think in 1988 there was a book by Wisdom Hunt that 88 reasons why the rapture will happen in 1988. And then when it didn't come, he wrote a follow-up, unironically called 89 reasons why the rapture will happen in 1989. And
He couldn't get the 90 reasons bought off by
I
a
think
book.
they stopped buying. I think people are like, hey, I'm kind of on to
yeah,
you, pal. Like I got this out of the bargain bin as it was, because it's 1991 and I saw this in the Kmart bin, and I was like, well, what's going on here? Maybe I'll pick this up. Like, whoa, but wait a minute, it's 1991.
yeah.
How did this happen?
That reminds me
It,
when I was a brand new Christian, and I didn't know anything. So like every book I saw on the Christian bookshelf with an interesting title, I bought that book, and
Assumed it.
I just had no sense of like what is valid and worth reading, and what's just snake oil salesmen. But yeah. So
On October 22nd, 1844, William Miller gathered 100,000 Americans around in there, and they were anticipating Christ's return. And the
Did you say
prophecy became
1844? 1 8?
1844.
Okay.
And the prophecy became widely known as the Great Disappointment. Miller died 5 years later after renouncing his biblical studies, but people kept gathering and waiting for this to happen. And one of the denominations that popped out of the Millerites were the Seventh-day Adventists. So
That's where they come
yeah,
from.
it is where they come from.
They
The
came out of the
watch,
Great Disappointment.
the Great Disappointment. So,
That's not a very good claim
right,
to fame for your denomination.
they did have a badass that went on Hacksaw Ridge, though. You know, dear God, help me save one more.
Oh, that dude
oh,
was
that's
he was an Adventist.
He was Adventist.
Okay.
Uh, the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society in 1918, the Jehovah's Witness president J.F. Rutherford predicted the return of Jesus and the end of the world would come in 1925. And he's quoted as saying, "We may confidently expect that 1925 will mark the return of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the faithful prophets of old, particularly those named by the apostle in Hebrews 11, to the condition of their human perfection." And though that didn't happen, the Jehovah's Witnesses went on to keep on predicting moments. By the 80s, they stopped predicting actual times. That's when I got involved with those people. But because the end times were so prevalent in their thinking, they literally stopped like living. They stopped. We stopped associating with people outside of the faith. Um, didn't do worldly things because it would spoil our bad habits. Didn't play things like Little League. Um, when you're small, you actually think about maybe going to Bethel and serving God in that kind of way in New York. And what you don't think about is, you know, going to college, or learning some kind of trade. Sometimes trade school's okay because you have to sort of make a living for your family while you're waiting for Jesus to come and kill everybody, right? So it's kind of an interesting worldview that the Jehovah's Witnesses have, and how everything in society kind of doesn't matter because, I mean, for the most part, the other than telling people to repent and to know that the good news is coming and the apocalypse is coming. Uh, Other than that, you're kind of sitting on your hands and waiting for Jesus to come back, and that's kind of one of my big problems with the whole second coming uh mindset is that
Mm.
I think not even without even really meaning to, I think a lot of Christians believe like, well, the end of the earth is coming anyway. Everyone's gonna get killed. It's gonna be a new earth, and it doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is afterlife, right? So, what did I do to punch my ticket to heaven? And that's kind of what we've been harping on the last, I guess, last few months on that topic
Hmm.
itself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think, well, couple of things. One, to keep this conversation moving, I would suggest that we completely stay away from the Eden versus heaven rebirth conversation because that'll just
Oh,
mire
sure.
us down, right? So, but fair point, right? Like, still totally agreed that seems to be the common um, kind of Christian belief is that there's not a lot we can do except kind of quote unquote be good and wait, right? Like that, regardless of what wait is, like that's kind of the default idea around Armageddon and the apocalypse. When we were kind of talking about doing this show, and we've touched on eschatology a handful of times on the show, I've been somewhat uninterested or less engaged in the conversation. And it kind of goes back to all the stuff that Dre was just mentioning, all of the failed predictions, all the way down to, even the more recent, they weren't Christian, but the stuff with the Mayan calendar of 2012 and, Y2K of 2000. I've growing up in the Southern Baptist Church in the 80s, that was pretty much all that was ever preached about was the second coming, hellfire, brimstone, um, tribulation, all that kind of stuff. That's literally every church service. Like I don't remember a church service that wasn't about one of those things. And the problem with it is that everything was the end of the world. You know, when the Russian scare with the Soviet Union, right? Preachers found a way to turn nuclear weapons into the ball of fire that was going to burn the earth. So it was going to be nuclear weapons that was going to bring about Armageddon. When AIDS epidemic started, it was, that the AIDS was a microbe,
Could it be
which meant it
Antichrist?
was which meant it was what was going to kill everybody because it was the pestilence that was going to kill everybody. When Gorbachev had a stain on his head, that was the wound, the grievous wound that he survived that made him the Antichrist. Like I feel like my entire childhood is one big PTSD of the end of the world. And not that I'm making an excuse for it, but it's caused me to be wildly uninterested in what any human being thinks they've read out of the Bible about the end times. If for no other reason than I really focused on the verse where Jesus said, "No man knows the coming of my Father of the Father to include the Son." Right. So I was like, I read that and I'm like, wait, Jesus said in his own words, even he doesn't know when God's coming, when this is going to happen. Like, why
No one
do
knows
we?
that day or hour, not the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father.
Right. Yeah. So then I'm like, why then do
So it's
people
definitely not
spend?
you, Miller or Rutherford.
Well, that's where
Right. So anyway, so all I'm saying is I just got it. I got my mind kind of in this place that said, there's all these people that spend, like, there's people that this is their whole life's work, right? Like they're eschatologists. There's people that this is their calling, if you will. And I'm like, it just seems like a fruitless endeavor. Now, let me bring that back around, because I don't believe that understanding our role into end times is irrelevant or fruitless, right? So just to be clear on, like, between the three of us, like, Dre, what you said a minute ago, I agree with, and Brian, we've talked about this, and I agree with that. So I don't think that we just shouldn't care and throw our hands up and go, what'll be, what'll be. Like, I'm not suggesting that at all. I'm simply saying that that's caused me personally to have like a really hard time giving any real meaningful attention to the finer points around it, if you will. I kind of settled on, if I can understand it broad strokes, that's good enough. I need to go focus on something that's more
Yeah. Well, the thing
interesting or
is that
relevant.
the broad strokes kind of take care of the finer points. I think a
I,
lot of,
yeah.
but one thing that strikes me as you guys are talking about this, and like it's basically, one horror story after another of failed predictions because people are preoccupied with the second coming and with end times. The first century church thought that Jesus could very well return in their lifetimes. Like they had the same expectation of Jesus' imminent return, could happen any minute.
Hmm.
But it wasn't this, it didn't motivate them to sit on their hands and waste their lives. It motivated them to work really hard to advance Christianity. They transformed the world. They took Christianity from a small sect of Judaism to a major world religion within one generation, because they were striving so hard
Hmm.
to get the good news to everyone.
Yeah.
And you guys mentioned the end of the world, and um that's not even that's not what the book of Revelation is about. There are disasters there. It's there's a it's a bad time for a lot of people, but it start the that narrative starts with a scene in heaven with the divine council. They're weeping because no one was found worthy who could open the seven seals of this scroll that needed to be opened in order to bring these things about. But then, stop your weeping. See, the Lion of the tribe of Judah has triumphed. He is worthy to open the seven seals. And then there's cheering, and it's like this is a great thing that we should be hoping in, but we've turned it into something. We've turned it into the end of the world. We've turned it into the worst thing ever that could happen that we should all be afraid of, and we've made it so that thinking about it has these disastrous effects. And I think that alone should send us all back to the drawing board and consider like what it is we're missing. And it also occurs to me that an aspect that we often leave out, um, which we shouldn't, because our show is about the divine council worldview. We are at war with dark forces who want to destroy humanity and undermine the church. Um, I think they've done a pretty good job of doing that by keeping us perpetually confused on this issue. There is a right eschatological view, and it's actually pretty hopeful and glorious, and it should motivate us to hope and to act to action and to be productive. And so but I mean, I think there are a few key passages that people tend to stumble over that sends them in the wrong direction.
Can
Um,
can I tell one more horror story?
okay.
One more horror story. So kind of the father, modern father of this dispensational view is John Nelson Darby, who kind of got his view of the end times in about 1830. Um, kind of popularized the Schofield Study Bible, which is all about Revelation. Um, so in the 1830s, he was uh he was kind of a Presbyterian Irish preacher, and uh in a pro Aleister Crowley website, this is what this has to say. When other children attended the Presbyterian church to listen and fantasize about angels and halos, or Moses parting the Red Sea, destroying armies of Egypt, Crowley sat there transfixed, listening to Darby tell the faithful attendees of rewards of heaven and the magical rapture, of the evil and terrible day when those that did not put their trust in Jesus were left behind to suffer in the hands of the anarchist and the beast, beheading or torture their only way to salvation. And as a boy, Crowley was given a dose of this message that millions of evangelical Christians would listen to in the future. During Crowley's childhood, the rapture was not widespread. The end time scenario, rapture, Antichrist, and his horrible tribulation, and the gnashing of teeth was not your run of the mill evangelical doctrine, but something exclusive to a handful of churches, which one little Alistair Crowley, that poor kid, emphasis mine, happened to attend. Crowley rebelled against the absurd doomsday scenario. He was one of the first to do so. He rebelled in an age where the doomsday scenario was not widespread phenomenon like it is today. I can only imagine what part of the doomsday cult was like during his boyhood. The thing is, we know how Crowley turned out after Darby's interpretation.
Right. Right.
So how many Aleister Crowleys or atheists or just people who turned away from the faith completely because they listened to some kind of fire and brimstone type preaching and it was like, yeah, that's really not for me.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think you could just expand that to a general category of just like how many people are atheists now just because of dumb preaching in general. Um,
Well, yeah, that's what I said.
yeah, I mean that's something that people tend to get preoccupied with. Um, and it's end times it's not a bad thing to be preoccupied with. It's just that they're they're trying to use it for the wrong purpose. Like they're trying to sort of become piggyback prophets themselves by like reading the book of Revelation or reading the Olivet Discourse and you know, figuring out how to read how to decipher the headlines to predict the future. And that's just not what it's for. Um I don't think they're motivated by the text to do that. I think it's just normal, just fallen human nature that causes us to fixate on a lot of the wrong things. And in fixating on those, we kind of miss what it's clearly saying. Like Matt mentioned, how Jesus himself said, no one knows the day or hour, not the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. That's from the what's called the Olivet Discourse. And I think this is one of the major reasons that there are preterists. Matt, you were reading up on preterism, weren't you?
Just at a enough to be conversationally dangerous, not.
You think there's
I mean,
there,
I might be the SME amongst the three of us on preterism, but I'm certainly not well enough read to defend it.
so you
Okay.
think all of the
Do you have a
discourse
question or
is why preterists?
Well, I was seeing if you had any,
like why or where? Is
yeah,
that what
what's their biggest reason for that? I mean, I think I have an idea, but
at a high level, what I read and my understanding, and like I said, anybody out there that's a well-formed preterist, feel free to correct me. But best as I can understand, they're coming at the prophecy in the Olivet Discourse and Revelation broadly, and they're simply reading it with a eye towards the events in the first century, right? Specifically 70 AD.
right.
And they're they're interpreting the prophecy differently. They would argue that all prophecy requires some type of interpretation because you can't read it word for word and it be just simple literal linear language,
Yeah.
right? To even to steal for, everybody listening, amongst the three of us, we talk about Heiser all the time. And Brian, I know you're not a fan of this part of Heiser. This might be the part of Heiser I like the most, is that Heiser has an opinion that you can essentially, without bringing some level of eisegesis to the table, you can poke a hole in any version of eschatology, that none of them hold up on their own because there's a certain amount of loopbacks and things you have to read into the words. Um,
Yeah.
I don't have enough education on the different versions of it to say I agree with that. I will say I like that position because it aligns with how I feel about it. But feelings aren't necessarily what's going to carry the day when it comes to interpreting scripture, right? I can admit all of those things, comfortably. But that's kind of where preterists are. They're just going to look at it and go, bro, like if you read this, like I guess, and I'm not coming at you, Brian, but when you explain, um, the afterlife and that you rightly pointed out that if you didn't come into the Bible with a preconceived concept of a disembodied heaven, it would be hard to pull disembodied heaven out of what you read, right?
Right.
A preterist would argue if you're not coming to Revelation and all of that discourse with a preconceived notion of a tribulation and some kind of millennialism, it would be pretty simple to see that this stuff's already happened if you simply just looked at the history books. That's their position.
Yeah. Well, here's my position. Like I
Real quick before you go there, and maybe you'll be answering this. What part of the Olivet Discourse in particular is not about the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem of 70 AD?
Well, so as you alluded, the setup for this is Jesus is condemning the religious leaders, and he tells them, look, your house is left you desolate. And then they're leaving Jerusalem, and the disciples are kind of surprised that he said that, and they're like, well, what are you talking about? How can you say that? Look at all these dope buildings that are. How can you say their house is left them desolate? So then Jesus says to them, do you see these buildings? I tell you the truth, there not one stone would be left on another. Everyone would be torn down. And then afterwards, they cross the valley to the Mount of Olives, and they come, and in Mark and Luke, they come to him and ask, Rabbi, when will this be, and what is the sign that it's about to take place? Matthew has them ask, Teacher, when will this be? What would be the sign of your parousia and of the end of the aeon? Some translators put it end of the world, which is a terrible translation, which just sets people up for even more confusion. So, and then the Olivet Discourse that follows is reading it, it's easy to think that he's conflating the coming of the Son of Man, what we would call his second coming, which they wouldn't have been asking about a second coming because they didn't know he was leaving, or at least they didn't accept that he was leaving. When they asked him what would be the sign of your, and the Greek is parousia, and it's a technical term in Greek. It's a term for like a royal visitation, like if the emperor or like a head of state or something visited a town, there'd be a big procession to receive them, and it meant like, when are you going to take the throne and rule? That's basically what they're asking. And so what followed after that question, what followed was him essentially, we tend to assume he's conflating the destruction of the temple with his second coming, but there's a key verse that it's easier if we like see it. But by the time it gets to verse 32 in Matthew 24, he says, now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door. I tell you the truth, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. So from just that by itself, you're going to see the signs. This is going to happen. You can, just like you can tell the seasons are about to change, you'll know this is coming. It's definitely going to happen in this generation. You can look for it, so you can be prepared. But then in the very next breath, he says, but about that day or hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and living their lives. But then Noah entered the ark, and then it came upon them. That's how it would be at the coming of the Son of Man. So, therefore, keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come. And sorry, let me back up a little bit. So will be that is how it will be at the parousia of the Son of Man. So he's definitely talking about his advent, his coming into power there. So
Yeah, he is. That's what he's talking about there. So
well,
when you,
he just said that is how it will be at the parousia of the Son of Man. So just to review, he tells them, learn this lesson from the fig tree. When it leaves, you're going to see these signs, it's going to happen. It's definitely going to happen in this generation. And then in the very next breath, but about that day and hour, no one knows. So here's what I'm getting at. Like, just for illustration, my background is in journalism. I've been a print reporter for past couple decades. I couldn't tell you how many times I've interviewed somebody and like taken down their notes accurately, and I write it out in an article, but seeing their words on print conveys a totally different meaning than what they said in person. Because when you're talking to somebody, there's all kinds of the inflection in their voice, their cadence, all kinds of nonverbal cues will emphasize certain things, and you get a sense of what they're saying much better than often than you'll get just from reading it on a paper. You get something totally different, and that's what convinces me this is eyewitness testimony, that this is a discourse Jesus actually gave, and we're just kind of getting the words that they wrote down in person. We read that as if he's conflating these two events, the fall of
I don't.
Jerusalem.
I don't read it like that.
Well, I think preterists do. That's why
I
they're
think
preterists.
preterists don't.
I don't think
I
they do
think
either.
I think preterists are saying that
Full
he
preterists
is
do.
using that Jesus in this moment is using apocalyptic hyperbole, because anytime that they talk about the Son of Man coming on a cloud, every single time it's mentioned in the Old Testament of that, it's when bad stuff is about to happen to a city or a nation. So it happened in Edom, it happened in Egypt.
Wait, back up. You said every time they talk about the Son of Man coming on a cloud.
Right, when they're talking about apocalyptic stuff,
Well,
right?
there's
So
there's one passage in the Old Testament that mentions the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, and that's in Daniel 7. Now there there are passages that use apocalyptic language for an impending disaster. Like I see where you're going with that. That like where they
or
mention
of the Lord. So this
the
is
the day of the Lord is
the
what you're talking about,
sure.
right?
Mhm.
And then so they're saying that this is the type of language that Jesus is using. So in other words, it has nothing to do with his coming. It has to do with the sign, because when they say the son is coming, or the day of the Lord is coming, it's always in reference to bad shit happening to a place. And bad shit is about to happen to Jerusalem, to the temple, because we're still talking about the temple here, because he just talked about the stones
Well,
that will be turned on each other.
yeah.
He at
Well,
no time did he say that he wasn't talking about that anymore. And there's
okay,
no, go ahead.
but the point of the discourse is, and I kind of wanted to look at this so that you could read that back into the rest of the passage. He's the disciples seem to think that when he's talking about the temple coming down, for whatever reason, probably for the reasons you mentioned, they think, well, that's going to be when he takes power, when he's going to level the temple and then rebuild it and miraculously, and then take the throne. And so when they're asking him this question, they think the temple coming down and him taking the throne are one and the same thing. This discourse is to disabuse them of that. He's telling them the temple is going to come down in this generation. You're going to see the signs of it, but the coming of the Son of Man, you're not going to know when that's going to happen. And also, when he starts off saying, let no one deceive you. Many will come in my name saying, I am he, I am the Messiah. Don't listen to them.
Right.
Because the point, like, there's going to be people telling them, essentially, like, you're not going to have to suss it
and that
out.
did happen. That did happen. A lot of people came
Absolutely.
to talk about the Messiah, and that's why there was a whole war with Rome in the first place, because they kept trying to overthrow their oppressors. And
Well,
I think this is Jesus warning them that if you keep playing that game, Rome is not going to lose.
Well,
You're going to lose.
Well, he's not. I mean, he's not warning them against. That's going to happen. The temple's coming down. That's his point here, and they're going to see the signs. But that's not the same thing as, like, in contrast to that, like, they won't have to suss out and look for the signs for the coming of the Son of Man. Everyone's going to see that. They're going to see the sign of the Son of Man appear in the sky. All the nations will mourn. They're like, no one's going to have to wonder if this guy or that guy is the Messiah, or if
Yeah, because the Messiah thing is in between there. That's why you don't listen, because
and
that
in between there, what
in
do you mean?
between people saying they're the Messiah and then the sign actually coming, saying, "Hey, it's too late. You're done." It says in verse 26, so if anyone tells you there he is out in the wilderness, do not go out there, for he is in the inner rooms, you don't believe it. As for the lightning that comes from the east is visible to the west, so will those coming of the Son of Man, which is the warning. Wherever there is a carcass, there will be vultures will gather. So I read somewhere that in the Greek, that vultures and eagles are sometimes the same word.
Sure.
So with Rome and their eagle breastplates and their eagle shields, and they're the ones that are gathering over carcasses as this destruction is happening to Jerusalem. This is just a warning of Rome. Like, you lose, it's over. And this is the end of the age. So the temple goes down. I think there's verses about the sacrifices will no longer be, because Jesus will later know that he'll be that last sacrifice. So that the age of temples, the age of the sacrifice, the age of the Jews of Israel is over.
Yeah, that's a valid reading of the end of the age there. But he's still talking about two distinct events.
I don't think so. I just don't.
Well,
I think it's the same event. It's
then,
what he's.
then,
Why would he
then,
talk about two events when he's given the description of the?
then what do you make of verse 32 through 35? He tells them these are the signs to look for, so that you'll know it's near. It's definitely going to happen in this generation.
Mhm.
But then in the next breath, he says, but about that day or hour, no one knows, not the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. So, like, that's either a contradiction, either he's contradicting himself in the same breath, or he's talking about two distinct events. One they'll see coming, the other they won't.
Why is that the only either or? Like, I feel like that's not, I don't think that's true. So hang on. So I think the three of us can collectively agree that Christ wasn't contradicting himself. So that's not on the table as a possibility, right? But there's also the possibility that he's telling them what it's going to look like so that they understand it when they see it. But then he's cutting them off before they say when. And he's like, don't ask me when, but this is what it's going to look like.
Well,
he's giving them the playbook so they can understand it as it occurs.
Well, he just told them when it's going to happen within this generation.
But that's not a date.
Yeah, but it's
Right,
it's
like
still
it happened literally 40 years
Right.
later.
He gave them a generational window, but he didn't go down to the day or the hour. Like, to me, those sentences are sequential.
Yeah,
I agree with you.
People were warned.
Hey,
there was the elect that actually left the town.
I think is
Sure.
a problem here is that the Bible's put like, at least, what version am I looking at? I'm
So
looking at
what?
this in the NIV, and there's a subtitle between those two sentences, and I think that's problematic because verse 35 says, "Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away." And then there's a subtitle that says, "The day and the hour are unknown." And it's almost like he took a breath and then changed conversations. And I don't think that's what happened. And I think that's kind of the point you're getting at, Brian, is are they connected or not? Because he says, let me read it this way, right?
Okay.
He's like, so look, learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as I'm not going to read this, but I'm going to paraphrase to get there. Listen to the fig tree. The twigs are going to get tender, and then it's going to happen. Just like that, know that it's about to be at the door. Things won't pass in this generation until they see it. However, I don't know the exact day and time. Even the angels don't know. And then he gives some more indications of what will happen.
Well, read those indications though. See,
Which ones?
you say then he gives more
below about as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the sun coming the Son of Man.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then it says, for in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage up to the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. That's how it's going to be at the coming of the Son of Man. So to me, it's further to the point that he's saying, I'm telling you, like when the fig tree starts to get tender, like you need to be ready because no one else is going to be paying attention. Just like with Noah, no one knew it was coming except Noah.
Well,
I'm trying to prep you all so you know and you can be prepared like Noah was.
In fact, for a minute, they were having successes. They were actually winning some of the skirmishes with Rome.
Okay, well, again, I want to draw your attention to, on the one hand, he's telling them these are the signs to look for so that you know it's happening.
Yes, I think we're all in agreement with that.
Okay, and the other hand,
on the other hand, he says you're not going to see any signs. You're not going to know it's happening until it's happening. Like these are.
I don't think that's what he's saying.
I don't think that's what he's saying.
That's literally what he's saying. What he says is, therefore keep watch because you do not know on what day your Lord will come. But understand if the owner of the house had known at what time of night the thief was coming, he would have kept watch and would not have let his house be broken into. So you also must be ready because the Son of Man will come in an hour when you do not expect him. Here he's telling them how to expect this, how to know this event's going to happen, how to expect it. He gives them a time frame for when it's going to happen. But then the other event, but about that day or hour, no one knows.
What other event?
I feel like that. I don't get that disconnection.
The coming of this. What do you guys think the coming of the Son of Man means?
Destruction.
So, okay. Before
I had some notes on when the same language gets used in the Old Testament. So, and since he's talking to his disciples, they would recognize that. They would be like,
there's
right.
one place in the Old Testament that mentions the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven.
You keep saying that, but
I bet you $1 billion. There's
well, if either one of us had $1 billion, I'd fucking kill you. So, just kidding. That's a weird
escalation.
There was a Ace from Stand By Me. Remember that scene?
Oh, okay.
When they're like, I bet you $1 million. I bet you $1,000 he doesn't. I bet you $1,000 he does.
He did say that. You're right.
And then Ace is like, "Well, you two shut the fuck up. If either of you had $2,000, I'd kill you both." Anyway, that's where that was.
So
sorry,
Matt. You mentioned before, and this is to this point. If you didn't already have this idea, this eschatological model in mind, you wouldn't get it from the text. You could just as easily get any other from the text. I 100% disagree with that. The default reading, that doesn't necessarily mean it's the correct one, but the default one is premillennialism, the idea that Jesus will return, sit on a throne, and rule the world with Jerusalem, Israel as his capital. That's what the Old Testament prophets promised about the Messiah. That's the Messiah in the normal sense of the term. He's the king from the line of David. He's going to restore the fallen dynasty of David. A king in the normal sense sits on a throne, and a visible throne on earth, and rules. And when you read all of the prophecies in the Old Testament about the Messiah, and there are thousands of them. I could give you example after example if you want. One of the most salient ones is in Genesis 49, when Jacob is blessing his sons, and he tells Judah, and he's kind of telling them their future and telling them about the future of their tribe and the lands they'll inherit. To Judah, he says, Judah is a lion, who dares rouse him? The scepter will not depart from Judah until it comes to whom it belongs, and the obedience of the nations is his. And he will tether his donkey to a vine, and his his donkey to his colt to a choicest vine. He'll wash his garments in the blood of grapes, and his eyes will be darker than wine, his teeth whiter than milk. And like all of that is that this is actually alluded to in John chapter 2 when he turns water into wine, but that's a different discussion. But that's the basic picture of the Messiah. The obedience of the nations is his. This was, the partial preterist reading of that is that it's fulfilled in David, but then the prophet Nathan told David that his son from his own body would rule on his throne, and he would rule forever. And so, that's why Jews to this day are still waiting for a Messiah, a king from the line of David, to rule on a throne. And you have all of these.
No, I agree with that. So I do agree with that, and I agree with.
Let me finish my point here. Just so that's the that's the default setting. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the correct one, but if there's a reason not to take that literally, then the burden is on the person who wants to argue that.
I have a response to that. So let me tell you before you make another point, because then we're going to get lost in the conversation.
Well, so just to round this off, that's what the coming of the Son of Man means.
I tend to agree with that. I don't agree with what Dre said about it meaning destruction. I don't know that this is explaining about the destruction of the temple specifically. I don't think the Son of Man coming in a cloud of heaven means the destruction of the temple. That's not how I read it. What I was going to say is that I agree with you that the default reading, or the default teaching, I would say, was that, the Messiah would rule and all that stuff. I agree with that. But I would also suggest that the default teaching was that Jesus was going to conquer all of the worldly enemies of Israel and deliver them, which is why the modern Jews don't believe that Jesus was the Messiah, because he didn't do those things, right? And I think Jesus knew that. So I think when he was making allusions to these other prophecies, I think there's a little bit of metaphorical play on words that he's purposely using, because he's explaining that some of these predetermined or default readings are incorrect or inaccurate, or probably misunderstood more correctly, right?
Well,
hang on.
Okay.
So given that, as I'm reading this, right, what I'm reading is that the conversation starting in this Olivet discourse from verse 32 is a continuous thought process all the way down through verse 41. I don't think there's a split there. That's all I'm saying with my read of this. Coming to this with to the best of my ability, because I might be the only one that can come into this Olivet discourse and read this portion and not have a preconceived amillennial, post-millennial, because I really don't. I know what I've heard in church talked about, and I agree that premillennialism is the most common version I've heard, but I've never given it any credence. I've never really let it permeate. I'm not a preterist, by the way. So I'm playing a certain level of devil's advocate with preterism just because it's a different look. I've certainly been intrigued by hearing that, maybe the book of Revelation isn't a forward-looking prophecy, and it was a prophecy, but it's already been concluded. I think that's a fascinating read. I don't know that I buy it. I don't necessarily have a dog in the eschatological fight. just, in full disclosure for, the purpose of this conversation, Brian, you asked me earlier today while we were kind of show planning, you know, if a full preterist believes that, Jesus has already returned and we're in the perpetual state, then what's the goal and what's the value and what's the future? That's a great question because I don't know what I would love to talk to a preterist and be like, so
Well,
what's the value of this whole game? Like, is this as good as it gets? Because
well,
this kind of sucks, right? Like, if this is it, like, yikes.
yeah, and for that reason, I think preterism, like full preterism, is I think it's a rejection of Christianity. I mean, it really is. Um, but the answer to that question, and the reason that's shocking to people is because people can say they're preterists and there's no scandal. They're still considered Orthodox Christians because they still fit right in because everybody else has this idea that the main thing is going to heaven. That's what they're hoping for. And then all this eschatology stuff, that's just kind of an afterthought when no, that's actually the main thing. That's what the gospel is about. And to reiterate, because this really can't be overstated, if you just read the Old Testament, um, just and pay attention to the promises that are being made to Israel. Like read the Psalms. You can open the Psalms at random, and you're going to find some reference to this future golden age when God's king reigns from Zion and God himself is ruling over the nations visibly and judging the nations with equity. And you have all these promises throughout the prophets when they're being carried off into exile and God is punishing them for their sins, but then he promises that he's going to redeem them. He's going to restore their fortunes. He's going to restore David's fallen tent and bring them back to the promised land. To then read the Olivet Discourse and say, oh, that's all figurative, and that was fulfilled in AD 70 when the temple was destroyed. To me, that's like telling a little kid that we're gonna go to Disney World. Just after the school year, just work hard, get A's. We'll go to Disney World, and then the school year is over, and instead of going to Disney World, you show them video footage of you burning Disney World down. Um, and then saying, yeah, see, it's basically the same thing. It's what I promised, right?
I think that's extreme. It's more like telling
It's
your kid
not.
if he gets an A, you're going to take them to McDonald's, and instead you take them to McDowell's. I think that's more similar. You take them to the Golden Arch.
Okay, let me repeat this. Okay?
R.I.P. John Amos.
Yeah, that was a throwback to
and James Earl Jones for that matter.
yeah.
Yeah, I caught the movie reference. It's Coming to America, but
Yeah.
no, it actually is like burning Disney World down. Like the promise is to restore Israel to sovereignty, to put a king from the line of David, to restore them to this Davidic Solomonic golden age. And instead of doing that, I'm just gonna burn down your capital and the temple and scatter you. That's the opposite of what that promise is.
Hey, I'm not arguing the point, right? But let me ask this, just for the sake of conversation. Don't you think what you just said?
Okay.
Do you not think that a modern Jew wouldn't say that's how they feel about Jesus and his fulfillment of the prophecy of the Son of Man?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I've actually had this conversation with them in Jerusalem
With
in
them,
yeshiva,
with Jesus?
With the Jews.
with Jews.
Brian
With all
rounded
of
up he rounded up all the Jews. He was
All
like,
the
"Hey,
Jews.
we need to have a thing."
There was a representative sample there.
Sure.
I mean, it wasn't all of the Jews, but there was enough of them. It was actually
strong. It was strong internal polling. That's for sure. That's what,
it was at a yeshiva in Jerusalem across from the Western Wall, where a stone's throw from where this conversation was had, actually. But
Yeah.
I asked them that question, and
so
it's probably a subject for a different.
But my point is, it's a fair like reverse question, right? Like them to say they're like, we were promised this big awesome dude that was going to crush our enemies, and we got a carpenter's son, and he got killed by the Romans. Like, how does that that match this?
Well, it actually, how does that match what's being in the Olivet discourse?
Mhm.
Well, because he's distinguishing the coming of the Son of Man from the destruction of the temple. One event,
That's not what I mean. That's not what I mean. I was talking about the going to Disneyland and then burning Disneyland down instead.
because the promise was conditional and they didn't meet the condition.
Right,
Um,
right. And so maybe the promise of Disneyland was conditional to
well,
you to continue with your argument or
I'm just making
your
the point that the destruction of the temple in AD 70 cannot be reasonably read as the fulfillment of God's promises to Israel for the Messiah. That it's a denial of that fulfillment. But the reason that preterists read it that way is because they read this passage as if the way you're reading it, as if these two events are the same thing, as if the coming of the Son of Man and the fall of the temple are they coincide, and because the temple fell, Jesus did not return to reign from Jerusalem, therefore it's a failed prophecy. And so they kind of get around that by, oh, no, it was fulfilled. You just have to reinterpret the coming of the Son of Man to mean something totally different than what anybody thought it meant.
is it? But what about? Couldn't it just mean that? Couldn't all of this coming of the Son of Man simply be Christ's resurrection?
No.
Why?
Um,
Why not that?
um,
Because that's
because,
honestly how I read it. If I tried to read this straight up without reading into it, then I read this bad stuff's going to happen. And even with Dre's thing about vultures and eagles and it being the Romans, then he could be talking about his own crucifixion and resurrection, and
well,
then it's going to happen, and then all the stuff's going to happen, and then all the goodness that follows is because of essentially he's what he's predicting is really the day of Pentecost, not anything more than that.
well, in a way in a way that's not totally wrong. Um, okay, so the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven. This is from Daniel 7. Daniel has a vision of these four beasts. Um, they're they're terrifying and they trample everything, and it's a lion with wings,
Right.
a bear, the leopard with four heads, and then this terrifying thing with horns and teeth, and then he sees this cosmic setting of the divine council, and then where books were opened and they pronounced sentence on the beast. And then he says, in my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man coming on the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations, peoples, and every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. And then Daniel asked what all this meant, and the angel told him that the four beasts are four kings. And then but the court will sit and as far be taken. Then the sovereignty, power, and greatness of all the kingdoms under heaven will be handed over to the holy people of the Most High. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all rulers will worship and obey him. So basically, he's saying like this is like this. Well, just that alone says that the holy people are going to assume power. That
Mm-hmm.
the holy people will rule the earth in place of those four prior kingdoms.
Mm-hmm.
That did not happen in the year 70 AD. Now, when Jesus ascended, when he went on in Matthew 28, when he told them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me, therefore go and make disciples of all nations, and baptizing in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, teach them to obey everything I've commanded you, and surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. Basically, that's the fulfillment of Daniel 7, where he came into the presence of the Ancient of Days and he rules at the right hand of the Father. But that prophecy I mentioned before about how the scepter will not depart from Judah until it comes to whom it belongs, and the obedience of the nations is his. Like that's a recurring description of the Messiah and the Messianic kingdom throughout the prophets and the Psalms. The obedience of the nations is his. He has all authority over the nations, but he doesn't have the nations' obedience. The Great Commission was about sending them out to teach the nations to obey him, but the nations, there's not a nation on earth that obeys him today. So we're clearly not in that state now.
Sure, but we're exponentially closer than we were in 25 AD, right? And I'm not
Well,
trying to be funny. Not nations, but as far as like, the number of languages that the Bible's written in and has been translated
sure,
into, right?
the
The
church has
reach,
spread.
right? So like, why couldn't Daniel 7 verse 14 simply be some kind of a indeterminate period of time that it's describing versus like a flash moment in time? We collectively agree, I think, the three of us, that the whole point of Christ coming, dying, and resurrecting was to start this process of the reclamation of God's kingdom, right? It's the kind of the last step, or the last step A in the the spiritual battle that had been going on since Genesis, right? All of the different steps had happened, and Deuteronomy, when God scattered the nations to the numbers of the sons of God, right? And then now Christ has come back to reclaim and kind of put everybody under the common flag, under the banner of the Most High. Well, if you read that into Daniel 7 to 14, right? He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and people of every language worshiped him. That could be read as from the moment of Pentecost ongoing, right? And we're still in chapter 14. Like it doesn't, I guess I don't read it as it had to be a big bada boom and
Well,
then it just happened, right?
the language of the Son of Man coming on the clouds comes with, that's where this comes from. And by the way, it's repeated in Enoch.
Yeah.
In
I
the
was
book of
thinking about that, but
parables.
I didn't want to start that conversation about it was in Enoch also.
Well, but I do think that's important because it's like, like all of these understandings were already pretty much in place before Jesus showed up. You had all the things the prophets said about the Messiah, what he would do, and then in Enoch you've got a composite of all of that stuff with that Son of Man imagery kind of as the centerpiece. And so that in the book of Enoch, the Jewish people had this kind of like completed picture of what the Messiah would be. That in the parable after the Olivet Discourse about the sheep and the goats, when the Son of Man comes and he comes in his Father's glory, that's kind of an expansion of what the coming of the Son of Man means. And he's hold on. This is important. Give me just a second. Okay, when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another as a shepherd separates sheep from the goats. He will put the and you guys know the parable. That's basically what he's describing is in keeping with stuff like Micah 4 and 5, where it talks about how Zion will be the highest mountain on earth, and all the nations will stream to it, seeking the light of Yahweh. And he's gonna judge between nations, and men will beat their swords into plowshares under the rule of the King of Israel. And that's where you get the thing about how he'll be born in Bethlehem. It's his origins are from days of old, that he'll emerge from Bethlehem Ephrathah. So the coming of the Son of Man, where he comes in the Father's glory, this is something everybody's going to see according to Matthew 24, and it's in keeping with all of these other passages. So Daniel 7, the Son of Man language, like this would have been understood, like they understood this to be the Messiah. And all that other stuff that I talked about from Genesis 49 and all the stuff from Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel about what the Messiah would do, that's all kind of packed into that. So by the time Jesus showed up talking about the Son of Man is coming, that's what they're hearing. And so this idea that this could have been fulfilled, but invisibly, that's just not what the prophecies say. That's just not in keeping with it. I think that's people trying to make sense of their misreading of Matthew 24 to say that it was fulfilled when it wasn't. And it wasn't, that was kind of actually the point of the discourse, that it wasn't the same thing as the fall of the temple.
Dre, you've been quiet for a minute, and I think you
Yeah,
were. I
I
felt
mean,
like you had a Joe Rogan moment where you lost a quote you were looking for or something
well, there's
like that.
there's lots of quotes. I don't really know how to move on because I think we pounded this. We
Yeah.
disagree. We can move on. I think that what's the next section? What's
Well, after all of that discourse, it's essentially the entire book of Revelation, right?
like Brian, where were you going? If so, let's just say you started
Well,
with your Olivet discourse. We all nodded and agreed and sang a song, then held
I've
hands.
got one question
Where were you going
before we
next?
move out of all of that discourse. I have one question, and this is a
okay.
genuine question. The next set of words down that we haven't talked about is: do we think that literally verse 40 and 41 of Matthew 12:24 is that where the scriptural basis for the rapture comes from?
No, that's from First Thessalonians 4.
Because that sounds rapture-y.
Um,
Well, it does. So read it. It says, because back when Jesus was talking about no one knows the time
yeah,
of the coming,
a lot of people read it that way.
then he says,
That's
two
true.
men will be in the field, one will be taken and the other left. Two women will be grinding with a hand mill, one will be taken and the other left. So there is this weird, like, people are just going to be gone all of a sudden kind of thing. I didn't know if there was more to it because I've always been intrigued with the fact that the raptural theology is also relatively new. And so, anyway, that was just a question before we moved out of this verse or this chapter. Sorry, Dre. Back to your
Okay.
question.
Well,
I just wanted to clarify that.
To close this point off, like to the listeners, I would invite you to read Matthew 24 and pay special attention to verse 32 and through through 44, and tell us what you think. Tell us, am I misreading it, or are these guys? So, and with that, but yeah, I think that I think that's where preterism comes from, is because that misreading. But the other two views of amillennialism, I think that there's merit to those views, but they're not complete. They don't really make sense of all the data. Like the amillennial view is that we're in the messianic kingdom now, and that they base it on things like when John the Baptist and then Jesus first started preaching, they said, repent, for the kingdom of God is here. Like they thought that it began with the messianic kingdom, began with Jesus' earthly ministry and continues in the church, and we're in it now, and that he comes at the end of it. I actually kind of I like that view. I think we should think of the church that way, that we are God's kingdom on earth, and that is the meaning of his miracles, him raising the dead and driving out demons. But it doesn't, but it still falls short of what the prophets said about the Messiah. That view that's kind of the standard view of the Roman Catholic Church. What's interesting, like you guys mentioned dispensationalism. I'm not a dispensationalist. People who subscribe to postmillennialism and amillennialism, well, I should go through postmillennialism also, that the idea that the church is going to lead to this golden age of Christianity in which there's peace between nations because the church has triumphed and then Jesus will return at the end. I think if we take the Great Commission seriously, we should absolutely work toward that as our goal. I think that should be what we're all going for. And if it's our mission to go and make disciples of all nations, we should go forth hopefully and with the belief that we can accomplish that. And if not that in its absolute complete post-millennial expression, we can make we can meet with a lot of success. Now, I don't think that's the true eschatology. I think it's the correct ecclesiology. That should be the correct understanding of the church and what our mission is. But we know that things are going to get worse as things go on, that we have an enemy who's going to resist. The more success we meet with, the more resistance we're gonna find from the enemy. We're not being resisted now because we're not much of a threat, frankly. We're losing ground, and Christianity doesn't really have much sway. And but one of the main reasons that I think, I mean, there's a verse in Acts 1 where it's another thing Jesus said before he ascended. The disciples asked him, Lord, are you at this time going to restore the kingdom to Israel? Which, again, what does that mean? Well, that's exactly what the prophets have been talking about, the restoration of David's throne, ruling Israel from Jerusalem, establishing Israel as chief among nations, and God's glory being visible on the earth through the Messiah. He didn't correct them on the concept. He didn't say, "Oh, no, you guys got it all wrong. It's a spiritual kingdom." No, he corrects them on the timing. It's not for you to know the times or dates the Father has set by his own authority, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you.
Mm-hmm.
As in, they're asking him, "Are you at this time going to restore the kingdom to Israel when we rule with you, as you said that we would sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel?" No, it's not time yet, but you are going to receive power in a few days with the Holy Spirit.
Well, it's almost like he's saying that's for you to do.
Well, but that's not what he's saying.
Well, if you tie all the things that you just said, because they're asking him, "Are you going to do this?" And when? And he goes, "Don't worry about the timing, because the Spirit's going to come be in you." So the
Well,
point, like, you could read that into saying him saying, "What do you mean, me do? You're going to do this."
but that's not what he said, Matt. He said they asked him about the timing, and he
Mm-hmm.
said it's not for you to know the timing.
Right.
He didn't say your concept is wrong, but the stuff I told you about power, that's going to happen in a few days. You're going to receive the Holy Spirit. But he didn't correct them on the concept.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay.
He didn't say, no, I'm not going to restore the kingdom to Israel. This particular part that is an aspect of that, you are going to sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel, but that's not right now. And also it goes back to the Great Commission thing where, the obedience of the nations is his. That's a key. That's a recurring descriptor of the Messiah and the Messianic kingdom. If he's sending them out to obtain the obedience of the nations, then clearly that hasn't been fulfilled yet. He has authority over the nations, but not yet obedience.
Mm-hmm.
But what's interesting is people who reject premillennialism, they always bring up how new dispensationalism. Well, that's crazy. Nobody in the church believed that until 1830. And if you're talking about like the pre-trib rapture and all the specific idiosyncrasies of John Nelson Darby's view, sure, but when you counter with except most of the early church fathers believed in premillennialism, then they make the distinction between dispensational premillennialism and historic premillennialism.
What's the difference of the two?
Um, the difference, like dispensationalism, it introduces it's kind of a cohesive, like this broader system that makes certain claims about the role of Israel, and critics will say that he offers a different uh, a different redemption, different plans of redemption for Gentiles than Jews. Um, and I think there's some merit to that. I think he does make too much of a distinction between Gentiles and Jews. Except like Jews do have a distinct role in history that is not that of the church. And I there's actually, I think dispensationalism has more going with for it than a lot of people acknowledge. And I'm happy to get into specific passages to support that, but it might be a bit beyond the scope here. It but if you look at the early church fathers, in the just to be accurate, a lot of them didn't write very much about eschatology. It wasn't a major preoccupation. Um, but what little they did write, what we can positively establish is that a lot of that was the prevailing view. People like Origen, who if he hadn't been so popular in a certain season, he probably would have been condemned as a heretic. He was more of a Platonic philosopher, um, who happened to be a Christian than he was a Christian, um,
Well, isn't that
per
wasn't that
se.
true of all critical thinkers of the time though?
No, not really.
Wasn't that the whole?
I mean, it was in the air, but Origin was like really into it. Like that was like he was uniquely. I mean, he was more of a philosopher in the Greek tradition than he was a Christian theologian. Um, but it's really as time went on and Platonism and Gnosticism began to take hold that they kind of moved away from premillennialism. So by the time you get to the fourth century with people like Eusebius of Caesarea, well, he writes about Papias of Hierapolis, who lived in the late first century, early second century. Said he was a person of low intelligence because he was he believed in the 1,000 year reign. Augustine was a staunch amillennialist, and it just so happens that this was the time that that the church was kind of merging with the Roman state, and so this idea of a redeemer coming from heaven to rule on earth to overthrow the evil empires of the world, well, that wasn't as popular anymore now that Christianity was the official Roman religion. Um, Now they sort of kind of, amillennialism sort of provided a theological justification for kind of merging the two. And now, like Catholics see the Pope reigning from Rome as the vicar of Christ. They see him as the fulfillment of God's promises to Israel to restore the throne of David. Um, so the idea that it's new, therefore it's probably wrong. It's Catholics are at least being consistent when they say things like that. But when for Protestants to say that, when we acknowledge that Christianity was basically apostate up until the Reformation, and then and the reform and John MacArthur actually makes a pretty good case for premillennialism and explaining that the reformers didn't spend a lot of time on eschatology. John Calvin wrote a commentary on every book of the Bible except for Revelation. Um, and so, yeah, we kind of had to rediscover like biblical truths about, so, and I think we messed a lot of it up actually. But if we're all agreed that Christianity was apostate through the Roman Catholic Church for throughout the Dark Ages, and that the Protestant Reformation was us breaking free of that and restoring true doctrine, then it's not a very good argument that, since premillennialism is new and we're more used to postmillennialism or amillennialism, therefore it's not valid, especially when the early church fathers were predominantly premillennialist. And I only say predominantly instead of unanimously because we can't positively verify the eschatology of all of them. A lot of them just don't say what their eschatology is because it didn't come up it wasn't timely to write about at the time because they were typically addressing some heresy or another or some other theological thing that was of the time. But when they did talk about their eschatology up until like the late second century, they were premillennial. So
So I think we might have gone maybe too far abroad of having these conversations. I think we might have like
I think we
jumped
got
the
to come back
shark,
next week. We kind of
right?
do.
Yeah,
We
because
got
I
to,
think I think this turned into just eschatology broadly, and we need
right,
to get back to what does it mean. I've
right.
got two questions. One, Dre, I think you did a bit more research on the dispensationalism. Did you have more of a like what makes them different or
No,
what the
I
big
think Brian
okay.
nailed it pretty much with, and they are broader. They have I think the dispensationalism has kind of seeped into our political atmosphere, right? So
I think that's true.
they the Christian Zionists are them. Um they tried to force the second coming by forcing Israel to be a thing. So this I forget the guy's name that was in the British parliament that kind of pushed for Israel to become its own nation.
Lord
But
Balfour,
Lord Balfour, the Balfour,
The Balfour
Balfour
documents or
Declaration.
right?
declaration. Yeah.
So that went against kind of our position on post World War. It went against our our treaties. And I don't want to get into Israel on stolen land or anything crazy like that, but Balfour documents being uh kind of that end times thing, they kind of rushed it, and it was a
Hmm.
it was a Zionist point of view,
I
which is
there
why
was absolutely going back to Dre to what I was saying about my childhood in the 80s was certainly in that 100%.
Well,
Everything that I heard as a conservative evangelical was exactly what you just said.
I mean, and even even with Donald Trump moving the capital back to Jerusalem. I mean, they're
The embassy, right?
the embassy. That's what I
Yeah.
meant.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's talks about making that new temple, because as soon as you build a new temple, right, then Jesus can come back.
Hmm.
So there's
yeah,
we're kind of trying to force the narrative, and it's based on this kind of
that's
end
another
times teaching.
misunderstood passage, though. Um,
Be
about
that as it may, I think our political climate worldwide, and then that lends to every time something happens in the Middle East, like, oh, that's it, that's the sign.
Right.
And there was
Yep.
a blood moon this time, and there was a blood moon when I was reading Jeremiah, and there was a blood moon. So
Yep.
like,
Yep.
okay, and
yeah,
then everything becomes end times, and this is
Yep.
it.
and so this is the setup for next week's episode where we talk about why it matters, or
Yeah, I think we need to.
I
I
think
think we need
so.
to.
Yeah.
I think we
Yeah.
definitely need to punt it to another episode. So this will be a four-parter.
yeah. So
You lucky listeners.
They're like,
or
what was that?
Well, one closing thought I have, and I don't want to drag us down to a rabbit hole, but just kind of like a quick question or point of order is, and this is a question I didn't do any research on this, but was the concept of the tribulation, is that an ancient church father thing, or was that also a 1900s concept? Because we keep talking about premillennialism as if the modern version of a definition of premillennialism would have applied to early church fathers. And I don't know that the tribulation was always understood to be the way we talk about it also, because
I think
like
Revelation says that, right? And it talks about how
one word, I did a couple of searches and I see it once, and
I mean,
it's
well,
not in any kind of
same with Antichrist. It's only in First John, and then twice in First John, and once in Second John.
right. But my point is for it to come up once. Revelation 7:14. He says, "I answered, Sir, you know," and he said, "These are they who have come out of the great tribulation. They've washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb." It,
Well, the tribulation is just all the horrible shit that's happening all the way leading up to.
that's
I think
that's what we read into it, is my point, and it's a question, not a
No,
statement.
because it also says that it's going to be what horrors like you've never seen and never will be again. That I'm paraphrasing there.
It sounds like Hellraiser.
But yeah,
um
there's
well, yeah, that's in the Olivet discourse with regard to the fall of Jerusalem. But so not so the end of the age in terms of the Jewish era, overlapping 40 years with the church era. But yeah, the whatever, that phrase is in the Bible about these are they who came out of the
Hmm.
great tribulation, and it's the great multitude in white robes from every nation and tongue. And this follows right after the passage where they, in contrast to the great multitude who cannot be counted from every tribe and nation, there's the previous chapter where the seal of God is placed on the foreheads of the 144,000 from the 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel. And so like
So
you
you're
have this.
saying yes? Like
I'm
that, I mean, I wasn't questioning. It was a genuine question. Like
Well,
because I know that the rapture is a newer concept, right?
yeah, and
So
it's a newer concept, and I think people are overly preoccupied with it, but I don't like I think there's a case to be made for it.
I don't have a dog in the fight. Like I
Yeah.
don't, I'm not anti or pro rapture. I mean, I'm pro rapture if I'm going to be in it. I'm not like pro rapture from a theology point of view, or anti rapture. I don't know, right? Like
Yeah.
I haven't spent enough time. I don't consider myself to be a biblical scholar in that sense, and I haven't read, the pros and the anti rapture treaties.
Do you want the quick rundown on it?
I mean, sure.
Okay.
I brought it
Well,
up. Sure.
it comes from the actual word rapture comes from it's the Latin for it's rapier or something. It's the translation of the Greek from First Thessalonians 4:17. After that, we who are alive and remain will be caught up together with him in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so we will be with the Lord forever. And the
Hmm.
Greek for caught up is a variation on harpazo, which means like to sneeze, to seize or snatch away. Same word in Philippians 2, where he said that Jesus did not consider equality with God a thing to be exploited or taken advantage of. The Greek is harpazoed. Um, and so, so that is biblical, but what they mean with regard to end times is it's based on that passage in Revelation where you have the multitude in white robes who cannot be counted from the Gentiles, contrasted with the large number of Jews who can be counted, who were sealed for a specific task on earth while all this is happening. So the Gentile church they've come out of the great tribulation. We don't know if it means that God took them out of the world while this is happening, or if it means they emerged on the other side of it victorious, having not surrendered to the beast. But that plus the Daniel 9, which is the prophecy of the 70 weeks, it gives this it's the 77s before the Messiah comes, and he gives a countdown of what the first 69 of the seven will look like, and at the end of the 69 sevens, the Messiah is cut off and has nothing, then it reads that the people of the ruler who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. Wars will continue until the end, and desolations have been decreed. So, and that's wars plural. So there's like more than one war that's going to happen after this 69th week. And then, so there's this kind of indeterminate amount of time between the 69th seven and then when he says the ruler who is to come, that meaning the leader of the people who destroy the temple, he will confirm a covenant with many for 1/7. In the middle of the seven, he will set up the abomination that causes desolation, and till the end of his decree is poured out on him. But that's where you get the 7-year tribulation period. And the I'll spare you all the details for how what goes into this, but like reading that passage, there's a definite plan that God has for the Jewish people to bring about these events, but that 490-year countdown is halted after the 69 sevens. There's this parenthetical period of indeterminate time before the final seven. The dispensational reading is that parenthetical time is the church age, where God is he's bringing about his purposes through the church. When the full number of Gentiles has come in, then the hardening of Israel will stop, and then they'll turn back to the Messiah. That's the 144,000. So that the bottom line is that God's purposes for the church in history, they're only as an alternative to his purposes for the Jews. When our purposes are finished, we'll have no reason to be in the world anymore. God will turn his attention back to the Jews and complete his purposes for history. And then that's the 7-year tribulation that the book of Revelation is supposed to be. And so if we don't have a purpose anymore, the reasoning is we get raptured. I don't think I believe that. I'm not dogmatic against it. I'm not I don't sneer at it the way a lot of people do today. But I do think Christians are way too preoccupied with it. And it certainly was not an emphasis in the early church. So
Well, I think Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins would disagree. They wrote a pretty long
yeah,
book series on that. I think they think it was a really big deal.
they're who I'm talking about when I say
Right.
some people are.
Oh, I know.
Yes.
Well, they're the reason that I think. I mean, they're one versus the other, right? They
Yeah.
might be the reason that so many take it seriously or over, sensitive to it, or vice versa. But it's funny that they wrote that first one in '95, which would kind of make them of the same age as us, which means they grew up in the same environment that I did, which
Right.
kind of
Hmm.
explains why they were so preoccupied with all that stuff.
Well,
But yeah, that dispensationalism really did rule the day for a while, at least in mainline Christianity, where I grew
Is,
up.
is that how you'll be when Jesus comes back?
Exactly.
Joe Dirt.
Yeah, and I think
Dear Tay.
Although I think REM had a better grip on the end times, Brian, because you
The
were
end of the
really
world
bothered by the end of the world
as we know it.
Not the end of the world, just end of the world as we know it. It's the end.
yeah, I hate those books, and that like the reason I hate dispensationalism is it gets us preoccupied with all the wrong things. Like it's not it's not something to be scared of. It's the central hope of Christianity. But we turn it into something to be scared of, something to be sensationalized and to fret over and to read the headlines, and we think this is what we're supposed to be doing as Christians.
That's the perfect teaser for next episode.
Yeah, I agree. Now that we've solved eschatology,
We solved it.
Totally.
Absolutely.
So, thanks, Brian. Thanks for solving eschatology.
glad to help. Glad to help.
Yeah.
But I'm sure there are people out there who agree with me. In fact, I'm sure most people do.
I mean,
And,
most
first of all-
most
First of
people.
all,
and
who cares? So
and,
I know there's some holes, and I know that some people might not have any questions. They'll know what the heck we're talking about, and then other people are going to have tons of questions. And I encourage that latter group Well, I encourage the former group to keep listening, but I the latter group to blast away at those questions and
Yeah,
give
for
us
sure.
something to answer,
For sure.
give us something to look up and give our take, and perhaps it won't suck. Perhaps, or maybe it will, and then you can laugh and be like, "You guys suck," and then just turn in next week and see if we suck again,
I would
which
certainly
we
say
won't.
our take has collectively sucked in the past.
Sure.
Hmm.
I'm sure it has.
Yeah.
Positive of it.
Brian will not agree with that, and that's and I think it's the collective part. He'd be like, because even if we did have a collective suck take,
He's like,
Brian's portion of
I'm
it,
just one
it
man.
wasn't his. He wasn't the reason
I
at
did
all.
my
Like
best.
I
I did my
just
best.
you guys
I only-
suck. So 2/3 of suck make it suck. So
I'm just one man.
thanks for sticking around. And with that, I will say, stay enlightened, stay curious, and we will see you next week. God bless.
Shalom.